Stephen, a 7-year-old boy with a brave heart and a deep love for his father, always believed in protecting those he cared about no matter the cost. One day, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his father Anthony Wright's life, Stephen makes a decision that changes everything. As he watches his dad about to marry Susan Martin, a woman who has been hiding deadly intentions, Stephen steps forward to reveal a shocking truth that no one could have imagined. His bold move stops the wedding in its tracks, but what happens next leaves everyone stunned. Why did Stephen's revelation lead to such dramatic consequences? How did this young boy's courage uncover the truth about his father's fiancée? And what ripple effects did it have on their lives? Stay tuned to find out. And before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if this story of bravery and truth resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's get into the story. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall stained glass windows of the historic church, casting kaleidoscope patterns of blue and amber across the assembled guests. The air hummed with anticipation as friends and family members whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting expectantly toward the entrance. At the altar, Anthony Wright stood tall in his impeccably tailored charcoal tuxedo, a nervous smile playing across his lips as he waited for his bride-to-be. "You look sharp, Dad," whispered 7-year-old Stephen, fidgeting with the small satin pillow cradled in his hands. The boy's tight curls were freshly shaped, and his miniature grey suit matched his father's perfectly. But while Anthony beamed with joy and hope, Stephen's dark brown eyes were clouded with something far heavier than wedding day jitters. They held fear, dread, and a terrible secret. Anthony glanced down at his son and gave him a reassuring wink. "Thanks, little man. You're the best ring bearer a father could ask for." He squeezed Stephen's shoulder affectionately, completely oblivious to the anxiety etched across the child's face. As the first notes of the wedding march filled the sanctuary, the congregation rose to their feet. All eyes turned toward the chapel doors, eager to catch a glimpse of the bride. All eyes except Stephen's. The boy's gaze remained locked on his father, his small hands clutching the ring pillow so tightly his knuckles turned pale. His breathing quickened. Time was running out. The door swung open, revealing Susan Martin in all her bridal glory. She glided down the aisle, a vision in white lace and silk, her blonde hair styled in elegant waves over her bare shoulders. Her blue eyes sparkled with what looked like joy as she approached the altar. Anthony's face lit up with pure adoration. "You look beautiful," Anthony whispered as Susan took her place beside him. She smiled back, her voice barely audible. "I can't wait to start our life together." The officiant began the ceremony, his words washing over the attendees like a gentle wave. But for Stephen, each passing moment felt like an eternity. He shifted from foot to foot, his eyes darting between his father and Susan. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like simple nervousness. But there was something deeper, more urgent in the boy's demeanor, something that no one else seemed to notice. As he stood there, young Stephen found himself lost in memories of the past 8 months. His mind drifted back to the day his father first introduced him to Susan. It was a warm spring afternoon when Anthony had picked Stephen up from school, his face beaming with an excitement Stephen hadn't seen in years. "I've got someone special I want you to meet, buddy," he had said, practically bouncing in his seat as they drove home. Stephen remembered how his stomach had twisted with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Since his mother Diane's death from cancer 18 months ago, it had just been him and his dad. The thought of someone new entering their lives filled him with uncertainty and a protective instinct he couldn't quite name. When they arrived home, Susan was waiting on the porch steps, her blonde hair catching the golden afternoon light. She smiled warmly as they approached, and Stephen couldn't help but notice how his father's eyes lit up at the sight of her, brighter than they had been since Mama passed. "Stephen, this is Susan," Anthony had said, his voice filled with pride and something that sounded like relief. She's become very important to me. And I hope she'll become important to you too." Susan had knelt down to Stephen's level, her blue eyes seemingly warm and genuine. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Stephen," she'd said softly, reaching out to touch his hand. "Your dad talks about you all the time. You're his whole world." In that moment, Stephen had felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe Susan could help fill the aching void Mama had left behind. Maybe Dad wouldn't look so tired and sad anymore. But as the weeks passed, that hope began to curdle into something darker. Stephen noticed how different Susan was when his father wasn't around. The warm smiles disappeared, replaced by cold stares and tight-lipped frowns. The gentle voice turned sharp and dismissive. It was as if two different women lived inside her body, one for Anthony, one for Stephen. One particular evening stood out in Stephen's mind with painful clarity. Anthony had been working late at his accounting firm, and Susan was supposed to watch Stephen. As they sat at the dinner table in uncomfortable silence, Stephen tried to engage her in conversation. "Miss Susan," he'd started hesitantly, pushing his green beans around his plate, "do you like space? We're learning about the solar system in school, and I was thinking maybe we could." "Stephen," Emily cut him off sharply, not looking up from her phone. Her voice was ice. "I'm busy right now. Eat your dinner quietly, please." Stephen had shrunk back in his chair, his appetite vanishing. He ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of his fork against the plate and the endless scrolling on Susan's phone. The rejection stung worse than any scolding. When Anthony was home, however, it was a completely different story. Susan would ask Stephen about school, laugh at his jokes, and even offer to help with his homework. She'd ruffle his hair affectionately and call him sweetie. But Stephen could see the falseness in her smile, the strain behind her eyes, the way her kindness evaporated the moment Anthony left the room. Anthony, on the other hand, was happier than Stephen had seen him in 2 years. He practically floated around the house, humming old songs Mama used to love, breaking into random bouts of dancing that would have embarrassed Stephen if they weren't so wonderful to witness. His father was healing, coming back to life. "Isn't Susan wonderful?" Anthony would often say, his eyes twinkling with hope. "We're so lucky to have her in our lives, aren't we, buddy?" Stephen would nod and force a smile, not wanting to burst his father's bubble of happiness. But inside, he felt increasingly alone and confused. Was he seeing something that wasn't there? Was he being unfair to Susan because he still missed his mother? Or was his instinct telling him something no one else could see? As the weeks turned into months, Susan's true nature became more apparent to Stephen. She began to make subtle, cutting remarks when Anthony wasn't within earshot. "Oh, Stephen," she'd sigh, looking at the mess he'd made while working on a science project, "you're such a handful sometimes. I don't know how your father manages you on his own." Or when he'd excitedly show her an A on a spelling test, "That's nice, dear. But you know, there's always room for improvement. Smart boys don't settle for just good enough." Each comment chipped away at Stephen's self-esteem, making him feel like a burden in his own home. He began to withdraw, spending more time in his room and less time in the common areas of the house. He stopped sharing his school achievements with his father, afraid Susan would find a way to diminish them. One Saturday afternoon, about 3 months before the wedding, an incident occurred that Stephen couldn't shake from his memory, the moment everything changed forever. Anthony had gone out to run errands and pick up supplies for a backyard barbecue, leaving Stephen and Susan alone in the house for about an hour. Stephen was in the living room, curled up on the couch watching cartoons and sipping apple juice, when he heard Susan's voice coming from the home office down the hall. At first, he thought she was on a regular phone call. But something in her tone made him pause. It was sharp, urgent, and completely different from any voice he'd heard her use before. Curiosity and instinct pulled him from the couch. He crept quietly down the hallway, his small feet silent on the hardwood floor. Susan's voice grew clearer as he approached. "The policy cleared, Ryan. 2.5 million. Phase 2 starts after the honeymoon. It has to look natural." Stephen's blood ran cold. Ryan? Who was Ryan? What policy? His heart hammered in his chest as he pressed himself against the wall, barely breathing. The kids suspect something, but the father's clueless. Susan continued, her voice dripping with contempt. Anthony's so desperate for a family that he can't see what's right in front of him. This'll be the easiest payday yet. Payday? Stephen's mind raced. What did that mean? Once we're married, we wait 2 months, long enough to avoid suspicion, then we make our move. Accidental drowning during the honeymoon would be perfect, but we might need to wait until we're back. Just stick to the plan, and we'll be set for life. Stephen's legs trembled. He wanted to burst into the room, to scream, to call his father. But fear paralyzed him. Before he could move, he heard Susan's footsteps approaching the door. He scrambled back down the hallway, diving onto the couch just as she emerged, her face composed and pleasant once again. Having fun, Stephen? She asked sweetly, as if nothing had happened. He nodded mutely, unable to speak, his mind reeling from what he'd just heard. That night, after Anthony came home and they finished dinner, Stephen lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, his mother's words echoing in his memory. Before she died, Mama had squeezed his hand and whispered, "Take care of Daddy for me, okay? Be brave. Be strong. Protect him." He was only 7 years old. How could he protect his father from something this big, this dangerous? Who would believe him? Over the following weeks, Stephen became a detective in his own home. When Susan was out or distracted, he searched for proof. He found the life insurance policy hidden in her designer purse, $2.5 million, taken out just 3 months after she and Anthony started dating. He found a second phone with photos of Susan kissing a white man with cold eyes, wearing the same necklace Anthony had given her for her birthday. Text messages that made his stomach turn, "Can't wait till this is over. Love you, RY." Stephen took photos of everything with the iPad his grandmother had given him for Christmas. He saved them to his email, terrified Susan would find them and delete them like she deleted other things. He tried to tell his father. One evening after dinner, he gathered all his courage. "Dad, I need to talk to you about Susan." Anthony looked up from his laptop, distracted. "What's up, buddy?" She's not nice when you're not around. And I heard her talking about." "Stephen," Anthony interrupted gently but firmly, "I know this is hard. Change is scary. But Susan loves us. She's trying so hard to be part of our family. Can you please try too? For me?" The hope in his father's eyes crushed Stephen's words before they could form. How could he take that happiness away? What if he was wrong? What if he ruined everything? So he stayed silent. And the wedding day drew closer. Now, standing at the altar with the ring pillow in his trembling hands, Stephen watched his father gaze at Susan with complete trust and love. The officiant's voice droned on, moving steadily toward the moment Stephen knew was coming, the moment that would change everything. "If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage," the officiant said, his voice filling the sanctuary, "speak now or forever hold your peace." Silence blanketed the room. 200 guests held their breath, waiting for the formality to pass. And then, a small, trembling voice shattered the silence. "I object." Every head in the church turned. Gasps rippled through the pews like a wave. And there, in his little grey suit, standing with his shoulders squared and his chin lifted despite the tears streaming down his face, was 7-year-old Stephen Wright. "I object," he said again, louder this time, his voice cracking but determined. "She's lying. Her real boyfriend is named Ryan. She wants Daddy dead for money. I heard her. I have proof." The church erupted into chaos. The church was a masterpiece of understated elegance. White roses cascaded from every surface, draped along the pews, clustered at the altar, woven into delicate garlands that hung from the old oak beams overhead. Their perfume filled the air, sweet and cloying, mixing with the vanilla scent of the 100 ivory candles flickering in the dimming afternoon light. The stained glass windows cast ribbons of colored light across the polished wooden floor, painting everything in shades of sapphire, ruby, and gold. It was perfect. Too perfect. Like a scene from a magazine or a dream that would dissolve the moment you tried to hold on to it. 200 guests filled the pews, their faces glowing with anticipation and champagne-induced warmth. Women dabbed at their eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs. Men adjusted their ties and checked their watches, calculating how long until dinner and dancing. At the altar, Anthony Wright stood like a man reborn. His charcoal tuxedo fit him perfectly, tailored to emphasize the shoulders he'd worked hard to strengthen at the gym these past months. His close-cropped fade was freshly lined, his dark skin gleaming under the soft candlelight. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They shone with something that had been absent for too long. Hope. Joy. The belief that life could be good again. Beside him, Susan Martin was the picture of bridal perfection. Her white lace gown hugged her figure before flowing out in layers of silk that whispered against the floor as she moved. Her blonde hair was swept up in an intricate style, a few carefully placed tendrils framing her face. Diamond earrings, gifts from Anthony, caught the light with every turn of her head. Her makeup was flawless, her smile radiant. She looked every inch the blushing bride, overcome with emotion as she gazed into her groom's eyes. She played the part beautifully. The officiant, a kindly older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, beamed at the couple before him. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice warm and resonant, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls." But in the front row, 78 inches away from his father, 7-year-old Stephen Wright sat frozen. His little grey suit matched his father's exactly. Anthony had insisted on it, wanting them to look like a team, a unit, a family. The miniature tie was knotted perfectly at Stephen's throat, though it suddenly felt like it was choking him. His small hands were clenched so tightly in his lap that his nails dug crescents into his palms. His jaw was locked, his breathing shallow and rapid. To the guests around him, his grandmother on his left, his aunt and uncle behind him, Stephen simply looked like a sad little boy struggling with big emotions. His eyes were glassy, his expression solemn. Poor child, they thought. Still missing his mother. Having trouble accepting his father's new wife. Completely understandable at his age. But what they mistook for grief was actually terror. Stephen's dark eyes were fixed on Susan's back, watching the way she tilted her head toward his father, the way her hand rested so possessively on Anthony's arm. From where he sat, he could see her profile, the curve of her smile, the flutter of her eyelashes. Every gesture calculated. Every word rehearsed. A performance for an audience that had no idea they were watching a predator circle her prey. His grandmother leaned over and squeezed his knee gently. "It's okay to feel sad, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with sympathy. "But your daddy deserves to be happy again. Susan seems like a real nice lady." Stephen's throat tightened. He wanted to scream. He wanted to stand up and shout the truth until everyone heard him. But his tongue felt thick and useless in his mouth. His body felt like it was made of lead. The officiant continued, his words washing over the congregation like a blessing. "Marriage is a sacred bond, built on trust, honesty, and love." Trust. Honesty. Love. The words felt like knives twisting in Stephen's chest. Behind him, guests whispered and smiled. Susan's friends dabbed at their eyes with tissues. Anthony's co-workers nodded approvingly, happy to see their friend finally moving on from his grief. The photographer moved silently along the edge of the room, capturing every perfect moment. The violinist waited in the corner, bow poised over strings, ready to play as soon as the couple was pronounced husband and wife. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. And Stephen sat paralyzed, watching it all unfold, knowing what no one else knew. Knowing what was coming if he didn't find the courage to stand. The insurance policy hidden in Susan's belongings flashed through his mind. Ryan's face in those secret photos. The cold, calculating voice he'd heard on that phone call, phase 2 starts after the honeymoon. The officiant turned a page in his book, his voice rising slightly. And now, if there is anyone here who knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. Stephen's heart hammered against his ribs. His moment was coming. Speak now, the officiant continued, pausing for the traditional beat of silence, or forever hold your peace. The grief support group met every Thursday evening in the basement of St. Michael's Community Centre. It was 6 months after Diane's death when Anthony finally worked up the courage to attend. He'd spent those months moving through life like a ghost, going to work, taking care of Stephen, paying bills, but never really living. The house felt too quiet. The bed too empty. His son's eyes too sad. "You should go, baby," his mother had urged, pressing the flyer into his hands. "You can't keep all that pain locked up inside. It's eating you alive." So he went. And that's where he met Susan Martin. She sat 3 chairs away from him in the circle, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a soft blue sweater that matched her eyes. No makeup. No pretense. When it was her turn to share, she spoke about losing her husband in a car accident 2 years earlier, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as they gripped a crumpled tissue. "The hardest part is feeling invisible," she said quietly. "Like the world expects you to just move on, to be the person you were before. But that person doesn't exist anymore." Anthony felt something crack open in his chest. Someone understood. After the meeting, they talked over stale coffee and store-bought cookies. She was easy to talk to, patient, asking questions about Diane without that pitying look everyone else wore. She laughed at his stories, touched his arm lightly when he got emotional. By the time they exchanged numbers, Anthony felt something he hadn't felt in months, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could feel human again. Over the next few weeks, Susan became a fixture in their lives. She brought casseroles and homemade bread, filling the house with smells that reminded Anthony of warmth and normalcy. She never pushed, never demanded anything. She simply showed up, offering support wrapped in understanding smiles and gentle conversation. She asked about his work, his family, his dreams. She seemed genuinely interested in every detail of his life. And she was wonderful with Stephen. At least, that's what Anthony saw. "You've got such a smart boy," she'd say, ruffling Stephen's hair as he showed her his homework. "Your mama would be so proud of you." But Stephen noticed things his father couldn't see. Or wouldn't see. He noticed how Susan's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at him, how it stayed fixed and plastic, like a mask she could slip on and off at will. When Anthony left the room to take a phone call or grab something from upstairs, that smile would fade entirely, replaced by a blank, almost bored expression. He noticed the way she'd flinch, just slightly, when he called her Susan instead of Miss Susan. Her jaw would tighten, her eyes would flash with something cold, and then she'd quickly rearrange her features back into that patient, understanding expression before Anthony turned around. "It's okay, sweetie," she'd say, voice dripping with forced warmth. "You can call me whatever makes you comfortable." But her eye said something entirely different. Stephen tried to tell himself he was being unfair. Maybe he was just angry that someone was trying to take Mama's place. Maybe he was looking for reasons not to like her because accepting her felt like betraying his mother's memory. That's what his grandmother suggested when he tried to express his unease. "Change is hard, baby boy," she'd said, stroking his hair. "But your daddy needs someone. And Miss Susan seems real kind." So Stephen swallowed his doubts. He tried to be good, to give her a chance, to make his father happy. But late at night, lying in bed with his mother's photograph on the nightstand, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about Susan didn't add up. The way she'd ask his father detailed questions about his job, his finances, his insurance policies, questions that felt too specific, too calculated. The way she'd look at their house when she thought no one was watching, her eyes appraising, measuring, calculating. The way she'd answered her phone once and walked quickly into the other room, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper before she caught herself and switched back to her usual sweet tone. And most disturbing of all, the way she looked at Anthony when he wasn't looking at her. Not with love or even affection, but with something that looked almost like cold, patient assessment. Like a hunter watching prey, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. But Stephen was only 7 years old. And Anthony was falling in love. It started small. So small that Stephen almost convinced himself he was imagining it. 3 months into the relationship, Susan had her own key to their house. She'd come over while Anthony was still at work, letting herself in to start dinner or tidy up. The first time Stephen came home from school to find her alone in the kitchen, she barely acknowledged him. "Wipe your feet," she said flatly, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "And don't leave your backpack in the middle of the floor. I'm not your maid." Stephen blinked, confused by the coldness in her voice. "Sorry, Just go do your homework." Quietly. He'd retreated to his room, heart hammering, wondering what he'd done wrong. But an hour later, when Anthony came home, Susan's entire demeanor transformed. She rushed to greet him with a kiss, then turned to Stephen with a bright smile. "How was school today, sweetie? Did you have fun?" The whiplash was dizzying. As weeks passed, the comments grew sharper, more frequent. Always when Anthony was out of earshot. One Saturday morning, Stephen came downstairs in his pajamas, his natural hair uncombed and standing up in all directions the way it always did when he first woke up. Susan was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, and her nose wrinkled slightly. "That hair of yours is just unmanageable, isn't it?" she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Have you thought about cutting it shorter? Or maybe, I don't know, doing something with it? It's just so." She waved her hand vaguely, leaving the sentence hanging like an insult. Stephen's hand went instinctively to his head. His mama used to love his hair. She'd spend Sunday mornings moisturizing it, shaping his curls, telling him he was handsome. Now he felt ashamed of it. Another time, Stephen got excited about a drawing he'd made at school and ran to show Susan, forgetting himself in his enthusiasm. She barely glanced at it. "That's nice," she said dismissively. "You know, Stephen, you're very sensitive, aren't you? Getting worked up over little things. Your father mentioned you cry easily. That's something you might want to work on. Big boys don't act like that." The words hit like a slap. Stephen hadn't cried in front of Susan. But she was making him feel like his emotions were a flaw, something embarrassing that needed to be hidden. The isolation was more subtle but more devastating. When Anthony suggested a movie night, Susan would sweetly counter with, "Oh, but Stephen has so much homework, doesn't he? Maybe we should let him focus while we catch that new restaurant downtown. He'll be fine for a couple hours." When Stephen's best friend Marcus invited him for a sleepover, Susan would interject before Anthony could answer. "Is that really a good idea? Stephen's been having trouble sleeping lately. Maybe he should stay home where he's comfortable." Stephen wasn't having trouble sleeping. But suddenly his father was looking at him with concern, and the sleepover was cancelled. She drove invisible wedges between them, always with Anthony's best interests at heart, or so it seemed. The worst part was watching the transformation happen in real time. Stephen would be sitting with Susan in tense silence, her face cold and disinterested, when they'd hear Anthony's key in the lock. Instantly, Susan would brighten. Her voice would warm. She'd reach over and squeeze Stephen's shoulder affectionately, saying something kind just as Anthony walked in. "I was just telling Stephen how proud we are of him," she'd say, her smile radiant. And Anthony would beam, believing he was witnessing his son and his girlfriend bonding. Stephen tried to find the words to tell his father. Several times, he opened his mouth to explain what happened when they were alone. But every time, he'd see the light in Anthony's eyes, that precious light that had been absent for so long after Mama died, and the words would lodge in his throat like stones. What if his father didn't believe him? What if Anthony thought Stephen was just being difficult, jealous, trying to sabotage his happiness? What if telling the truth meant watching his father's smile disappear again, watching him sink back into that awful grey sadness that had filled their house after the funeral? What if speaking up meant losing his father completely? So Stephen stayed silent. And Susan's mask slipped further and further, until the warmth only appeared when Anthony was in the room, and the rest of the time, Stephen lived with a stranger who looked at him like he was an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved, a burden she was forced to tolerate until she got what she really wanted. His father. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks before Anthony planned to propose. Susan had left early, claiming she had a headache, and for the first time in weeks, it was just Stephen and his father at the dinner table. The house felt different without her presence, lighter somehow, like they could breathe deeper. Anthony was scrolling through his phone, smiling at something, probably a text from Susan. Stephen pushed his spaghetti around his plate, his stomach twisted in knots. He'd been rehearsing the words all day at school, practicing during recess while the other kids played. He had to tell someone. He had to make his father understand. Dad. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Anthony looked up, still smiling. Stephen's heart hammered against his ribs. Can I talk to you about something? Of course, buddy. What's on your mind? Anthony set his phone down, giving Stephen his full attention. The openness in his father's face made Stephen's courage falter, but he pressed on. It's about Susan. Anthony's expression shifted slightly, not closed, but cautious. Okay. What about her? Stephen took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. How did you explain something that happened in looks and tones and small cruelties that left no evidence? She's different when you're not around. Different how? She's not nice to me, Dad. She says mean things about my hair and tells me I'm too sensitive, and the words were tumbling out now, faster, desperate. She acts like she doesn't want me around, and then when you come home she pretends to be nice, but it's not real, and I don't think. Stephen. Anthony held up a hand, his voice gentle but firm. Slow down, son. Take a breath. Stephen gulped air, his eyes already burning with tears he was trying to hold back. Big boys don't cry. Isn't that what Susan had said? Anthony reached across the table and took Stephen's small hand in his larger one. I know this has been hard for you. I know you miss your mom. I miss her too, every single day. His voice cracked slightly. And I know having Susan around is a big change. It's an adjustment for all of us. But Dad, it's not about missing Mama. It's about... Stephen, listen to me. Anthony squeezed his hand. Susan is trying really hard. She cares about us. About you. I've seen how patient she is, how much effort she puts into making you comfortable. Do you know how many women would run the other way from a single dad with a kid? He smiled sadly. Not many, buddy. Susan is special. She loves us. The word us hit Stephen like a punch. Not you. Not me and you. Us. As if they were already a unit, already a family that included her. I just don't think she. I need you to try, Stephen. There was something in his father's voice now, something heavy and tired and almost pleading. I need you to really try to give her a chance. She's going to be part of our lives, and I need to know you're okay with that. Can you do that for me? Stephen looked at his father, really looked at him. At the dark circles under his eyes that had finally started to fade. At the way his shoulders didn't slump quite so much anymore. At the light that had returned to his face after so many months of grief that had turned him into a shadow of himself. And Stephen understood. His father needed Susan. Or thought he did. Needed to believe that life could be good again, that love could exist after loss, that their broken family could be repaired. How could Stephen destroy that? How could he take away the first happiness his father had felt since Mama died? What if he was wrong? What if he was just a jealous kid who couldn't handle change? What if speaking up meant watching his father crumble all over again, and this time it would be Stephen's fault? Can you try? Anthony asked again, his voice soft, hopeful. For me? Stephen felt the weight of his father's hope pressing down on him like a physical thing, crushing his small truth beneath it. He thought of his mama, of her last words to him, "Protect your daddy." But how did you protect someone who didn't want to be protected? How did you save someone who was walking willingly toward danger? "Yeah," Stephen whispered, his voice hollow. "I can try." Anthony smiled, relief flooding his face. "That's my boy. I knew you'd understand." He stood and walked around the table, pulling Stephen into a tight hug. "Everything's going to be okay, buddy. You'll see. We're going to be a family again." Stephen buried his face in his father's chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, feeling the steady beat of his heart. And he swallowed every word he'd wanted to say, every warning, every truth, letting them sink like stones into the pit of his stomach where they sat heavy and cold and silent. His father was happy. That had to be enough. Even if Stephen knew it was built on a lie. Stephen woke to darkness and the pressing need to use the bathroom. The glowing numbers on his nightstand clock read 2:17 a.m. The house was silent except for the familiar creaks and settling sounds he'd known his whole life. He slipped out of bed, his bare feet padding across the cool hardwood floor. He was halfway down the hallway when he heard it, a voice drifting up from downstairs. Susan's voice. But it sounded wrong, different from any tone he'd ever heard her use. It was sharp, clipped, businesslike. And she was supposed to have gone home hours ago. Stephen froze, his hand on the bathroom doorknob. Every instinct told him to keep walking, to mind his own business, to go back to bed. But something about that voice made his skin prickle with unease. Before he could think better of it, he crept toward the staircase, moving as silently as he could. The voice grew clearer as he approached. Susan was in his father's home office, the door slightly ajar, light spilling out into the dark hallway. Stephen pressed himself against the wall at the top of the stairs, hardly daring to breathe. The policy cleared, "Ryan." Finally. Susan's voice was cold, calculating, nothing like the warm sweetness she used with Anthony. 2.5 million. Not bad for 8 months of work. Stephen's heart began to hammer. Ryan? Who was Ryan? No, he hasn't suspected a thing. He's so desperate for someone to love him, it's almost pathetic. The proposal's happening next week, I made sure to drop enough hints. She laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth. Phase 2 starts after the honeymoon. We stick to the timeline, no deviations. Stephen's hands gripped the banister so tightly his knuckles ached. This couldn't be real. This had to be a nightmare. He would wake up any second now. It has to look natural, obviously. Accidental drowning during the honeymoon would be cleanest, tragic newlywed accident, devastated widow, insurance pays out within weeks. But if that doesn't work, we wait until we're back. Heart attack's easy enough to arrange with the right compounds. Either way, by Christmas I'll be a very wealthy widow. The words hit Stephen like physical blows. Drowning. Heart attack. Widow. She was talking about killing his father. She was planning to murder him. The kid's more perceptive than I expected, Susan continued, irritation creeping into her voice. He suspects something's off, but he's too scared to push it. And Anthony? She laughed again. Anthony's completely clueless. He sees what he wants to see, a loving woman who's going to give him his perfect little family back. He actually tears up when he talks about how grateful he is that I accept his son. It's nauseating. Stephen felt bile rise in his throat. The cruelty in her voice, the contempt, this was who she really was. Everything else had been an act. Listen, Ryan, I need to go. He's a light sleeper, and I told him I just came down for water. We'll talk tomorrow. Love you. A pause. Yeah, I know. 3 more months and we're done. This is the last one, I promise. After this, we retire. Stephen heard movement, the creak of a chair, footsteps approaching the door. Panic seized him. He couldn't let her know he'd heard. He scrambled backward as silently as he could, his heart racing so fast he thought it might burst from his chest. He made it to his bedroom door just as the office light clicked off downstairs. He slipped inside and eased the door closed, then dove into his bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. His whole body was trembling. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to steady his breathing, tried to look like he was sleeping, like he'd been sleeping all along. Footsteps on the stairs. The soft pad of Susan's feet down the hallway. A pause outside his room. Stephen held his breath, certain she could hear his heart pounding through the walls. The footsteps moved on, toward his father's room. The door opened and closed softly. Only then did Stephen let himself breathe again, great gasping breaths that felt like drowning. Tears streamed down his face, soaking into his pillow. His mama's photograph watched him from the nightstand, her smile frozen in time, forever kind, forever safe. "Mama," he whispered into the darkness, "what do I do? Please, Mama, tell me what to do." But his mother couldn't answer. And upstairs, his father slept peacefully beside a woman who was planning to kill him, completely unaware that his 7-year-old son now carried a terrible, crushing truth that no child should ever have to bear. Stephen didn't sleep again that night. He lay in the darkness, watching the ceiling, listening to every sound, his mind racing. He had to stop this. He had to save his father. But how could anyone believe a child over the woman they loved? Stephen waited 3 days for his chance. 3 days of watching Susan smile at his father across the breakfast table, 3 days of pretending he didn't know what he knew, 3 days of terror clawing at his insides every time Anthony left for work, every time he watched his father drink the coffee Susan made, every time he saw them kiss goodbye. The opportunity came on Saturday morning. Anthony had an emergency meeting with a client, something about quarterly taxes that couldn't wait. Susan declined to come along, claiming she wanted to stay and deep clean the house as a surprise. The moment Anthony's car pulled out of the driveway, she grabbed her keys. "I'm running to the store for cleaning supplies," she called up the stairs, her voice saccharine. "Be good." Stephen watched from his bedroom window as her white sedan disappeared down the street. His hands were shaking. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, "Never go through other people's things, baby. That's not right." But nothing about this was right. And he needed proof. Something real. Something undeniable. He found her designer purse on the kitchen counter, a cream-colored leather bag that cost more than his father made in a week. His heart hammered as he opened it, half expecting her to materialize behind him. Inside, wallet, makeup, keys, breath mints. And beneath a silk scarf, folded papers. His hands trembled as he unfolded the first document. Life insurance policy. Insured, Anthony David Wright. Benefit amount, $2,500,000. Date issued 3 months ago, right after Susan had convinced Anthony to update his coverage for Stephen's future. Beneficiary, Susan Marie Martin. Stephen's stomach lurched. There it was, written proof of the value she'd placed on his father's life. He kept searching. Tucked in a zippered pocket, he found a second phone. Not the iPhone she used openly, but an older Android with a cracked screen. His fingers fumbled with the power button. It wasn't locked. The photo gallery opened, and Stephen's world tilted. Picture after picture of Susan with a man, a white man with cold blue eyes and slicked back hair. Susan kissing him. Susan laughing in his arms. Susan wearing the silver necklace Anthony had given her for her birthday, the one she'd cried over and said she'd treasure forever. In the photos, she was wearing it while this stranger's hands were around her waist. Stephen scrolled to the text messages, his vision blurring with tears. Ryan, 3 more months, babe. Then we're set. Susan, can't wait till this is over. Playing happy family is exhausting. Ryan, just keep him happy. We've come too far. Susan, I know. Love you, R.Y. The word swam before his eyes. He grabbed the iPad his grandmother had given him for Christmas, his hands barely steady enough to unlock it. One by one, he photographed everything, the insurance policy, every page. The photos of Susan and Ryan. The text messages. Each image felt like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold. He heard a car door slam outside. Panic flooded through him. He shoved everything back into the purse exactly as he'd found it, his fingers clumsy with fear. The iPad went under his shirt. He raced upstairs just as the front door opened. "Stephen." Susan's voice drifted up, honeysuite and poisonous. "You okay up there?" "Yeah," he managed, his voice cracking. "Just playing." In his room, he emailed the photos to himself, to his grandmother, to his own cloud storage, anywhere he could think of. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He had the proof now. The question was, would anyone believe him in time? 2 days before the wedding, Stephen made his final attempt. Anthony was in the garage, loading gifts into the car for the rehearsal dinner. This was it, Stephen's last chance to reach his father in private before everything became irreversible. "Dad, I need to show you something." Stephen clutched the iPad against his chest, the screen displaying the damning photos he'd taken. "It's really important. It's about Susan." Anthony paused, his face already clouding with frustration. They'd had versions of this conversation before, and each time it ended the same way. "Stephen, buddy, we talked about this. The wedding is in 2 days. Can we please?" "No, Dad, you have to see this." "I have proof." "Proof of what?" Susan's voice cut through the air like a blade. She appeared in the doorway, her smile perfectly arranged, but her eyes locked onto the iPad in Stephen's hands with laser focus. "What are you showing your father, sweetie?" Stephen's blood turned to ice. "I was just..." She moved fast, crossing the space between them in 3 strides. Her hand shot out and plucked the iPad from his grip before he could react. "Oh, is this that game you've been playing? Let me see." "Susan, give it back." Stephen reached for it, but she held it high above his head, her thumb already swiping across the screen. "Anthony, could you grab those boxes from the kitchen? The ones with the centerpieces." Her voice remained pleasant, controlled. "I'll help Stephen with his game." "Sure, babe." Anthony disappeared into the house, oblivious. The moment he was gone, Susan's mask shattered. She grabbed Stephen's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt, and dragged him behind the garage where his father couldn't see. Her face was inches from his, her breath hot against his skin. "What did you think you were doing?" she hissed, her voice venomous. "You're going to hurt him," Stephen whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I know what you're planning." "I heard you." Her hand clamped over his mouth. "Listen very carefully, you little brat." Her eyes were dead, empty of anything human. "If you ruin this wedding, if you say one word to your father, he will hate you forever. Do you understand? You'll be the reason he lost his chance at happiness. You'll be all alone. No father. No mother. Just a sad, unwanted child nobody wants." She released him and held up the iPad, her fingers flying across the screen. "Cloud storage. Email. Deleted. Deleted. Deleted." She handed it back to him, empty of evidence. "Try again, and I'll make sure everyone knows what a disturbed, jealous little boy you are. They'll send you away, Stephen. To doctors. To specialists. Your father won't be able to look at you." She straightened, smoothing her hair, the mask sliding back into place. When Anthony emerged from the house, she was smiling again, one hand resting gently on Stephen's shoulder. "All good here," she said brightly. "Right, Stephen." He nodded mutely, the threat hanging in the air between them like smoke. That night, Stephen lay in bed staring at his mother's photograph. The house was quiet, his father asleep down the hall, Susan thankfully gone home. Stephen touched the glass frame gently. "Mama," he whispered, "I'm scared. I don't know what to do." She deleted everything. "Dad won't listen." And in 2 days. His voice broke. In 2 days, she's going to be his wife, and then she's going to kill him. The photograph stared back, silent, frozen in a moment when the world still made sense. Stephen wiped his eyes and sat up. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clearing. If no one would listen in private, he'd have to make them listen in public. At the wedding. In front of everyone. It would humiliate his father, destroy the perfect day Anthony had dreamed of. But a ruined wedding was better than a dead father. He printed out the photos again from his grandmother's email, folding them carefully and hiding them in his suit pocket. 2 days. He had 2 days to find his courage. I won't let her hurt him, Mama, he promised the photograph. I'll protect him. Just like you asked. The ceremony proceeded like a dream. Susan's vows were perfect, beautifully written, delivered with just the right catch in her voice. Anthony's eyes glistened with tears as he promised to love and cherish her for the rest of his life. The rest of his life. The words echoed in Stephen's head like a death sentence. The officiant smiled warmly at the couple, then turned to face the congregation. We have now come to that moment in the ceremony where tradition invites us to consider the sacred nature of this commitment. His voice carried through the hushed sanctuary. If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. Silence blanketed the church. 200 guests sat motionless, waiting for the formality to pass. This was the moment that never happened in real life, the dramatic pause that existed only in movies. Stephen's heart hammered so hard he could barely breathe. His small hand slipped into his suit pocket, fingers closing around the folded papers. His mama's voice whispered in his memory, "Be brave. Protect him." "I object." The words came out smaller than he'd planned, but in the absolute silence of the church, they carried like a gunshot. Every head turned. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto the small boy in the front row. Stephen stood on trembling legs, his voice growing stronger. "I object." Anthony's face went from confusion to concern. "Stephen, what are you?" "She's lying, Dad." Stephen's voice cracked, but he pushed forward. "About everything. Her real boyfriend is named Ryan. She wants you dead for the insurance money. I heard her talking to him. I have proof." Gasps rippled through the congregation like a wave. Susan's face drained of all color, her carefully applied makeup suddenly stark against her white skin. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. "Stephen, that's enough," Anthony started, but Stephen was already moving, pulling the folded papers from his pocket with shaking hands. 3 months ago, she took out a life insurance policy on you. $2.5 million. He unfolded the first document, holding it up. "Here. Look at it." "And these," he held up the printed photos, his voice breaking. "These are pictures of her with Ryan. She's wearing the necklace you gave her, Dad. The one she said she'd treasure forever." The church erupted. Voices overlapped, shock, disbelief, confusion. Anthony stood frozen, his eyes darting between his son and his bride. Susan's carefully constructed mask was crumbling, her face cycling through emotions, shock, rage, fear, calculation. "This is insane," she said, her voice sharp, desperate. "He's a child. He's confused. Anthony, you know how he's been." "I heard you," Stephen said, tears streaming down his face now. "That night you stayed late. You were on the phone with Ryan. You said phase 2 starts after the honeymoon. You said it had to look natural. You called Dad pathetic." Susan's eyes went wide. For one heartbeat, she stood paralyzed. Then she gathered her dress and bolted toward the side exit, her white gown flowing behind her like a banner of retreat. The church exploded into chaos. People were standing, shouting. But Anthony's voice cut through it all. "Call 911. He turned to his groomsmen, his voice commanding, clear. "Block the doors. Don't let her leave. Marcus's father, a former linebacker, moved with surprising speed, positioning himself in front of the main exit. Another groomsman caught Susan by the arm just as she reached the side door. She struggled, her perfect composure completely shattered, mascara running down her face. Anthony dropped to his knees in front of Stephen, his hands on his son's shoulders. "The photos," he said urgently. "Let me see them." Stephen handed them over with trembling hands. Anthony's face went through a transformation as he looked: shock, betrayal, rage, and finally, devastating clarity. "My God," he whispered. "My God, Stephen, you tried to tell me." In the distance, sirens began to wail. The police arrived in under 4 minutes. 3 squad cars, lights flashing, sirens cutting through the stunned silence that had fallen over the church. Detective Maria Rodriguez was the first through the door, her eyes taking in the scene with practiced efficiency, the bride in handcuffs held by 2 groomsmen, the groom on his knees clutching his son, 200 witnesses in various states of shock. Susan was read her rights in front of everyone. She didn't say a word, her face a mask of cold fury. But when they brought Ryan in 20 minutes later, picked up at a hotel downtown where he'd been waiting for her call, something in her broke. She started talking, trying to cut a deal, throwing him under the bus with desperate speed. Detective Rodriguez knelt beside Stephen, her voice gentle. "You're a very brave young man. Can you tell me what you heard?" And Stephen did. Every word. Every threat. Every overheard conversation. The detective's face grew grimmer with each revelation. "We've been investigating these 2 for 8 months, she told Anthony later at the station, after statements had been taken and Susan and Ryan were locked away. 3 other widowers across 2 states. One died last year, drowning accident on his honeymoon in the Bahamas. We could never prove it, but your son just gave us everything we needed. He saved your life, Mr. Wright." The ride home was quiet. Anthony kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other holding Stephen's small hand across the center console. Neither spoke. There were too many words and somehow not enough. At home, in the house that suddenly felt lighter despite the darkness outside, Anthony finally broke. He pulled Stephen into his arms and wept, great, shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside him. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "God, Stephen, I'm so sorry. You tried to tell me and I didn't listen. I was so desperate to fix us, to stop being sad, that I almost," his voice cracked. "I almost got myself killed and left you all alone." Stephen clung to his father, his own tears soaking into Anthony's shirt. "I was so scared," he whispered. "I thought you'd hate me if I ruined the wedding. I thought I'd lose you." "Never." Anthony held him tighter. "Never. You're the bravest person I know. You saved me, buddy. You saved us." They cried together on the living room floor, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had almost been destroyed, holding onto each other like lifelines. The next weeks were hard. The story made the news: boy saves father at wedding, con artists arrested. Anthony had to field calls from reporters, lawyers, concerned friends. But he also made other calls. To therapists. To support groups for himself and Stephen. To his mother, who came and stayed for 2 weeks, cooking and cleaning and holding her grandbaby when the nightmares came. Slowly, carefully, they began to heal. Dr. Okafor, their therapist, helped them rebuild what Susan had nearly destroyed. She taught Anthony to listen, really listen, to his son. She taught Stephen that his voice mattered, that speaking up wasn't betrayal but love. They learned to talk to each other again, to trust again. 3 months after the wedding that never was, Stephen asked to visit his mother's grave. It was a crisp autumn morning, leaves crunching under their feet as they walked through the cemetery. Anthony hung back, giving his son space. Stephen knelt beside the headstone, tracing his mother's name with one finger. "Hey, Mama," he whispered. "I did what you asked. I protected him. It was really scary, and I almost didn't, but I remembered what you said about being brave." His voice broke. "I miss you every day. But Dad and me, we're gonna be okay. We're taking care of each other now, just like you wanted. A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of autumn and change and new beginnings. That evening, Anthony and Stephen cooked dinner together, Diane's famous spaghetti recipe. Stephen stood on a stool at the stove, stirring the sauce while Anthony chopped vegetables. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally bumping shoulders, the radio playing softly in the background. "Dad," Stephen said as they set the table. "Yeah, buddy. Are you happy?" Anthony paused, really considering the question. He looked at his son, this brave, extraordinary child who had saved his life, and smiled. "You know what? Yeah. I am. Not the way I thought I'd be, but better. Real. You and me, we're good, right?" Stephen nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Yeah. We're good." They ate dinner together, just the two of them, their home filled with laughter again. Real laughter, built not on illusions but on truth. On trust. On the unbreakable bond between a father and son who had survived darkness and come out stronger on the other side. Justice had been served. Their family had been preserved. And love, real love, had been proven not by grand gestures or perfect weddings, but by listening. By believing. By choosing each other, always. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.